Hello, my name is Elyse Gonzales, and I'm the director here at Ruby City. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am very excited because this is our latest installment in our series of Taller Talks that we are doing in conjunction with the Carver Communities Cultural Center here in San Antonio. This collaborative program allows us to speak with contemporary artists, learning about them and their practice in general. We will begin tonight's program with showing the single screen version of True North. And so during the course of our conversation that'll follow, I hope that you will feel free to put any questions that you might have for Isaac about his film in the chat, and we'll pose those questions to him at the end as time permits. But first, let me introduce our distinguished guest, Sir Isaac Julien. Isaac is known for his poetic films and multi-screen installations, which explore with insightful nuance Black and queer identities, the diaspora, migration, and the underlying effects of capitalist economic systems. He has received numerous accolades for his celebrated films, such as Looking for Langston in 1989, and then in 1991, his feature, Young Soul Rebels, which won the Semaine de la Critique Prize at the Cannes Film Festival. His foray into more gallery and museum spaces garnered yet more attention and acclaim. In 2001, he was nominated for the Turner Prize, followed by numerous awards, including the James Robert Brudner Class of 1983 Memorial Prize and Lecture at Yale in 2016, and the Charles Wollaston Award in 2017 for Most Distinguished Work at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition. In 2018, he was made a Royal Academician. He was awarded the title Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire in the Queen's Birthday Honors in 2017. And I hope all of you heard in my mentioning of Isaac's full name that he is now a knight. So he was included in the Queen's 2022 Birthday Honors list for his services to diversity and inclusion in art as an artist and filmmaker. Isaac's works have also been shown internationally in solo presentations, including the Zeitz Museum of Contemporary Art Africa in Cape Town, Platform L, Contemporary Art Center in Seoul, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris, the Mac Niterói in Rio de Janeiro, Museo Universitario Arte Contemporáneo in Mexico City, the DuPont Museum in the Netherlands, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum Brandhorst in Munich, Centre Pompidou in Paris, and the Moderne Musik in Stockholm. And that is the abbreviated list. His most recent installation, once again, Statues Never Die, just opened at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. It will be on view there through September 4th, and I highly encourage for those of you who can to go check it out because it's incredible. I'm also pleased to note that he will be the subject of a major exhibition at Tate Britain scheduled to open in spring of next year. It will feature over 40 years of films and large-scale film installations. Julien's rich artistic practice is complemented by his academic work at UC Santa Cruz. Julien is a distinguished professor of the arts, and he leads the Isaac Julien Lab there with arts professor and independent curator Mark Nash. Isaac splits his time between Santa Cruz and London, where he maintains a studio. I am delighted to have you here tonight, Isaac, and very grateful to you. As a longtime friend of our late founder, Linda Pace, your history with our institution is deep and ongoing. In fact, I'm proud to tell all of the rest of you that we have the largest repository of Isaac's work. And so this deep dive into True North is personally gratifying, but also very important from a curatorial and archival perspective so that we can continue to fully represent the breadth and depth of your incredible practice. So thank you for being here, Isaac. Welcome. And at this point, we'll kind of turn it over to screen the single channel version of True North, and then we can jump into the questions. Isaac, thank you for that. Thank you for allowing us to screen that single channel version in advance of the film and our talk.
Very welcome.
And I would just encourage everyone that the presentation here at Ruby City is really extraordinary because it's the 3-screen version, but they are, large scale screens. It's a very immersive experience in an environment that has been crafted specifically for this film, among others, by Isaac. And so I encourage everyone to stop by if you can to view the film, and it's quite extraordinary, and it's also a great place to be when it's 107 degrees outside, as it has been for many weeks here. So please come on by. The show will be up through the rest of the year. And I guess, Isaac, as we begin to talk with, about the film, I think I always like to start at the beginning, which is kind of like, I'd love to know, how did you discover the story of Matthew Henson, and what prompted you to go ahead and make this large scale installation about him and what he's done?
Well, thank you so much, Elyse, first of all, for your wonderful introduction. And, it's a great honor to be able to do this talk here now. And I guess we could say that, in a way, the beginning of True North, in a rather curious manner, began in a kind of wax museum. In fact, it was called the Great Blacks in Wax Museum in Baltimore, which is a wonderful museum. And when I was making a film called Baltimore in 2003, we filmed in the Great Blacks in Wax Museum with Melvin Van Peebles, and we made a waxwork of Melvin Van Peebles for the piece, the late Melvin Van Peebles. And curiously, I came across one of the waxwork figures, which was a person in a sort of Arctic kind of dress, and it was titled Matthew Henson. And of course, I didn't know that somebody, of African American descent had sort of been an explorer or had gone to the North Pole. I didn't know his story. And of course, it's fascinated me because I was always really interested in somehow making some existential piece about a Black person or subject in a white sort of space, preferably sort of snow or ice, but in a way I didn't have the alibi, to make the work in a sense. Matthew Henson created this sort of alibi. But then, of course, once I started to research a little bit more and found out more about Matthew Henson, and I realized that, that his story was really quite an incredible story, and one where he was really part of those histories which are very much marginalized and kept out of view. And as I researched more, then I became very fascinated with the telling of the story and giving it a few twists, so to speak.
Yes, definitely a few twists. And so, okay, so now that you've found this subject that is fascinating to you, but also kind of fits parameters that you were to a certain extent looking for in order to investigate aesthetically this, the Black figure, Black subject in the Arctic landscape, a white landscape. I'm wondering, like, how do you move from that beginning to the actual project itself? Like, do you start collecting clippings? Is it about tracking down books? How do you move from that first initial stage?
Well, of course, one of the things which was very fortunate for me was when I was making this work, I was part of this wonderful group in Goldsmiths, where I was involved in a kind of research project with sort of art historians, Arit Rogoff, sort of art theorists like Sarat Maharaj. And Arit Rogoff actually sort of led me in the direction of looking at a book that I should read, which was called Gender on Ice. And it's written by a writer called Lisa Bloom. And basically, this was a fascinating book because the way in which it was, in a way, very at the forefront, I would argue, of thinking about questions of ecology and gender and race and how those intersected. And she was really a student of Santa Cruz University, which is where I now teach, history of consciousness, of course. And her book basically had a whole chapter on Matthew Henson. And that really turned things around for me in terms of thinking about these questions. And in a sense, the beginning of what would now be, I guess, described as a kind of polar aesthetics and questions of ecology and gender, which are very much intertwined in sort of this whole narrative. And of course, the question of indigeneity, of the Inuit subjectivities, who, of course, were the people who really led, so to speak, the discovery of the North Pole. Well, of course, they lived there. But I think it was really these sort of important texts, which were foundational, but also then coming across other texts, which led me to other avenues in exploring the narration and narrative of the work.
And so, as you begin to think about, this research that you've been reading and thinking about, how do you then, are you sketching out in a narrative fashion what you envision eventually doing, or are you storyboarding? I mean, I don't think that's necessarily how you work, but I'd be curious to know, like, how do you begin to order those thoughts that you're having and thinking about in relation to this subject, so that you can then discuss with your collaborators, the folks that are part of the film that you'll be bringing on board as your team?
Well, I mean, in a way, I think, in a sense, one of the main things really was the whole idea of what would be the kind of terrain that might represent the North Pole. And of course, we didn't shoot in the North Pole. We shot in Iceland and also in sort of upper north of Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
And so in True North, there are many different sort of, if you like, northern sort of parts of the hemisphere, which we're shooting in the Arctic North. But I would say that we're very much involved in trying to, in a way, think about questions of landscape, but also how we're going to, in a way, give this narrative a kind of twist. And I guess the twist was right there in Lisa Bloom's work, the title Gender on Ice, and the way in which one of her chapters for grounded women explorers who were involved in these sort of expeditions. But then I think at the same time, coming across a text which was based on an interview with Henson in the late 50s, a young student, Fowler, interviewed Matthew Henson, and from that interview, where he described the moment where he felt like he was in danger because he had somehow kind of perhaps stumbled across or reached the North Pole before Perry in the 1809 expedition, that basically this really started to worry Perry, and basically it resulted in him actually not talking to Mr. Henson, and Henson never received any other recognitions in relationship to being part of the sort of expedition. And but at this particular moment, he talks about him being very nervous and hiding the ammunition in the snow, hiding guns, and this very treacherous kind of moment where this question of intimacy and codependency, obviously, in relationship to Perry, in relationship to Henson, and the sort of Inuit guides, and this kind of hierarchical aspect where the question around the competition. And of course, this is all very ironic because, as we know, true north doesn't really exist. There's difference between magnetic north and true north. Did anybody really get to, as it were, kind of this destination or not, is questionable. But it was enough challenge to Perry to create the conditions for Henson to fare for his life in this extreme sort of condition and environment. And so this led to the casting of Vanessa Mairy. We've seen this image, who had already been a femme fatale sort of cyborg in Baltimore. She's, as it were, that's meant, retraces Henson's steps in the work, so to speak. And then, of course, the kind of narration, which is spoken by a woman protagonist, which obviously represents her voice, but is, of course, a meditation on this interview, articulating Henson's narrative.
Right, and it seems like just even sharing, just even hearing that text really lays out for anybody the kind of all of these different there's so many emotions, right, that come out when just reading that text, from fear, as you were mentioning, to kind of awe, even at having achieved such a feat. And so I imagine even just having that text for those that you're working with, that were part of your team as you directed, that it was very useful for them to help to help them kind of get into the mindset, so to speak, as well for you. And so when do you start to bring others in? Like, when does that feel comfortable? I mean, because you live with these ideas, I imagine, for a long time, or maybe not, and then you begin to share them. And so when do you feel ready to do that, as in relation to this film? Let's keep it more specific, less broad.
And I think this is where the question of location becomes very important, because, of course, once we made the kind of original recce trip, or the scanning of the locations, and to actually go to very specific areas in Iceland, which are kind of more towards the sort of end of winter. In a sense, those locations bespeak the kind of ways in which you're going to transverse and film the location. Of course, I'm very much dependent in collaborative efforts with a wonderful production team actually called True North. And so, I did ask them if I could borrow the name of the company for the title of this work. And also there's a way in which the script and how it comes about, or at least its visualization, is, through photography, still photography, building images in succession over a period of time, but having something that's very specific, site-specific, to where people will be sort of transversing through the space, where we imagine our protagonists, acted by Vanessa Mairy, will be posed, the kind of casting of the sort of Inuit characters, which is very important. And of course, the deliberate sort of uncasting of Perry, because Perry isn't in this narrative. In a way, you could say that it maybe has an omnipresent sort of aspect in terms of the landscape itself. And I think in an existential sense, all these questions around sublimity, the sublime, and the ways in which this space and what it meant for the characters are sort of written out of history, their kind of gaze and look onto the space and how that's signifying, so I think you have all of those questions in relationship to exploring these different ideas
And I
together,
mean,
collaboration with lots of people, not just myself.
right. And I mean, it's interesting to hear you speak about the landscape in this way as kind of a generative aspect that's part of the process. And so was, I imagine, the first time you filmed in Sweden and Iceland?
It was, yes, and it was the first of many sort of, in a way, filming sort of, you could call them expeditions in Iceland, because I would go on to shoot another work in 2012 called Playtime, which was shot in Reykjavik in Iceland. Playtime is based on the whole question of what happened when capital was stopped in its tracks and crashed, so to speak. And it was very severe in places like Iceland and Reykjavik, where you just couldn't literally get money from banks. Everything was frozen. And I did a portrait of a friend of mine where this severely kind of affected him. And then in 2015, I returned making a work called Stones Against Diamonds, where I went back because I was really fascinated to see what had been the ecological effect on the locations when I had filmed in Iceland, previously, 10 years ago. So, and that was very interesting to see the ecological difference to the landscape.
Because I think what we're hearing from a lot of our visitors is that there really are tapping into not only the story of Matthew Henson, but the kind of environmental aspect of the work, which is present but more subtle in some ways. And yet, especially I think we see it maybe more obviously with Vanessa Myrie's hand, as it's in the, there's Matthew Henson in his Arctic gear. But I think we see that pretty obviously with Victoria Myrie in her hand as it's in the water, as it's flowing from the faucet. But then we also have these references to the larger scale, larger bodies of water that are present in the film. And did you envision that kind of thread of environmentalism you were expecting that from the beginning in True North, or did that kind of come about as you went through the process of filming?
Well, I think, if I'm really honest, I think in 2004, the idea of the way in which ice was sort of melting was more kind of seasonal, because when we filmed, which was sort of, the end of winter, sort of very, very beginnings of spring, but it's very cold in that particular time, and still, fairly kind of, wintry conditions. One was aware, and at the end of the film, you have those very large chunks of glacier which are on the beach, where you have Vanessa Myrie character, who walks between the glacial modes. And in a sense, there are lots of different ideas I was, in a way, trying to develop, in this sort of closing scene. But I think when I returned in 2015, the amount of glacial kind of sort of fraction of ice on that location had increased to an incredible degree. And, so I think the kind of beginnings of that question of ecology was present. And I think you're absolutely right that I think now how the work reads retrospectively really permeates, what would become a very important question of global warming and the way in which, ice and particularly these kind of conditions are really foregrounded in the ways that we're thinking in our consciousness in relationship to the planet. And so I think, in a way, True North takes on this other sort of message. So I think, we know explorations in these areas about the competition for, mineral extraction, that there's a sort of whole question of how these spaces are now being read and charged and signify in a different sense. And also we realize that there's a way in which the populations which have been sort of inhabiting these spaces for some time, are in contestation. And so I think all of these things come out in the work. And so I think when we see the scene with Vanessa Murray character, surrogate Matthew Henson, with this Inuit sort of companions, all of this kind of, I think, reads in a very particular manner, in a different manner from my original inferior intentions, which I think is good, because of course it shows with time, because of course this work is now almost shot, 20 years ago, it really does resonate in a very particular manner to a new audience.
And so, okay, so to move away from maybe that idea, but to kind of get to the nitty gritty logistics, which I'm kind of curious about, is like, this is a very hostile environment, though it is not the North Pole, right? But it looks pretty intense. And I guess I'm wondering, like, did filming in this new environment for you, but also one that's so extreme, the logistics of that must have been incredibly challenging. And how did that affect, did that affect in any way what you filmed or how you filmed?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, this is a whole preparation for shooting in this very challenging climate. And I think there's a way in which certainly when we were shooting in this particular moment, I mean, there was a whole way in which one would have to prepare oneself. But I think also, for example, when we went back in 2015, shooting Stars Against Diamonds, and we went back because there's a possibility for us to film in an ice cave. I mean, it was completely impossible, for example, to ensure the crew that we're filming with, for example. And at one point, after shooting for, a day or two, the crew did turn around to me and said, right, Isaac, we need to get out of this cave right now, And so, yeah, I mean, there is a kind of extremity in terms of the ways in which one takes that question of trying to foreground landscape in a particular manner. But I think one's also one is very, in a way, taken with this sort of space and, in a sort of more existential sense, the way in which I've always been very interested in what would be seen as a kind of Fanonian idea. I'm thinking here of Frantz Fanon. I'm thinking about the way that he spoke about the question of the disalienation of the Black subject and the white subject, but the way in which, in a metaphoric sense, you have this sort of existential sort of relation, which begins to question yourself. Because of course, that one would not survive very long in these conditions, which begs the question around Henson and Perry, and I mean, just the tenacity, of being able to endure those conditions in this particular manner. But then you're very struck by the construction of it in this very masculinist way, the fact that there were women who explorers who are involved in this, and to a certain extent, the story of Henson is not a very well-known story in the United States. So I think, and for those reasons, there's also the question about the sort of Black subject being in a space where it would probably be seen not permittable as well, and occupying that space in a particular manner. And all those sorts of ideas which link back to a sort of history where indeed people were pursuing particular paths in very unique ways, which are then written out. So I think all of those things very much resonate in making the work, and in a sense, the landscape itself brings these to the foreground in the making of the work.
Which is perhaps maybe a good time to discuss some of the touchstones or points of reference that you talk about when you mention True North. And one of them was romanticism, so 19th century painting, and especially I think you mentioned the sublime, right? This idea of the sublime, which is kind of being awestruck by nature, and by that also the kind of fear of that as well, which is all wrapped up into this complex feeling, which is known under this big rubric of the sublime. And so there were, what drew you to think about or reference those? I mean, of course, I imagine the landscape took you there immediately, but could you speak a little bit about that reference point that you talk about?
Well, in a way, Caspar David Friedrich, of course, is someone that everybody is familiar with, in art historical terms. And in a way, I was interested, of course, in that as a kind of representation that one could play with. But I was also interested in the idea of this question of the Black subject, in particular in African-American culture, the role that certain protagonists have played in being able to, as it were, cross the Atlantic, or if I borrow Paul Gilroy's term from his magnificent book, The Black Atlantic, and infusing that journey, whether it's the Jubilee Fish singers who are singing for the abolition of slavery, and in a way journeying to Europe and to Scandinavia, and through song occupying these different spaces, or someone like Matthew Henson, who's doing that through this very gritty sort of experience in an unrecognized manner, but nonetheless is of course not afforded the kind of narrativization, but nonetheless is doing those activities. In a sense, they become, if you like, benchmarks or sort of icons of the ways in which they can be seen as very much linking these discourses, which are the way in which Black culture is making these different interventions in these different spaces. And so I think, in a way, I guess there's the kind of slave sublime, you could call it that. I'm borrowing here from Paul Gilroy's work, of course. And I think, whether it's Jubilee Fish singers and the songs that they sung, or whether it's Matthew Henson's story, there is this question of violence and ammunition, and having to hide bullets, in the ice, and all of those things, which brings on this other narrative, this threatening sublimity, which is also part of this question of transgressing boundaries, and so I think there are these things that are at play in the making of the work, which are kind of hinted at in the soundtrack, in the kind of, subliminal manner.
I was going to say, absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways, you really get a sense that the audio is almost is another character in it, because it's such, from the music to, and the way that it changes throughout the film is so, it's palpable also because of this, it's kind of great because with the installation setup and the nice speakers, you can really feel it in your body, but it's also, you feel it because it's alternatively kind of exhilarating and terrifying and frightening too, that it conveys all of these different things. And then of course, with the audio, it really helps to emphasize some of those points, especially the kind of fear and horror that is being conveyed through the film. And we're seeing some more of your research articles. This is the article that you'd mentioned earlier. This is where some of that audio that is in the film is derived from. Quotes, correct, Isaac?
No, that's right. And in a way, it's precisely this archival research which enables one to think then about what would be the sonic intervention made for the piece. And so we really were working with the subsonic aspect of the sound in the work to create this sense of tension and suspense, I guess, and danger. The danger which was faced by Henson, the question of the natural forces of nature and relationship to death, which is always very close, the perishing of bodies in relationship to these extreme conditions, and of course the question of race, which is also centrally placed in these narratives, and of course gender. And so I think all of these things are intertwined in this work. And I guess when I think about this shot, it's very much this direct stare to the camera, to the audience, where you're witnessing something which may seem not completely clear, but it's nonetheless communicating this sort of atmosphere and gives the lead for how you're going to construct the kind of musical track for the work.
Right. I mean, we are seeing all of the individuals that have been left out, essentially, and then the audio itself. I mean, I would think that is that just seems very challenging to me to try, because unless you created the audio yourself, which I know you did not, there are the credits in the film that I've seen, but how, I imagine you can describe all of those emotions that are part of the work, and of course the facts and that are woven throughout the film and that are part of the history. But how do you then convey, how do you get the audio that you want to get? That's my long-winded question that I've summed up inelegantly.
No, I mean, like, it takes a lot of work to get the audio to register, because in a way I'm not making it work in a completely conventional sense, because even though there's the emulating of a Caspar David Friedrich landscape, which was just seen in the last image, of course I'm interested in communicating the kind of rougher aspect of this sublime image, so to speak. And so the questions of relationship between animals, for example, the use of and the representation of the so-called ways in which animal and man kind of in a way merge, you could say, through the use of the barking, but also thinking about the Inuit throat singing, for example, in the work, which I had to get special permission to use. So that was not something which is just kind of readily available. I had to write to a particular sort of tribe who basically, looked at the work and then, agreed, to have this sort of throat singing. And then also there is very interested in the whole question of the ways in which one began to find that there were other groups, who were in a way First Nations people, such as in northern Sweden, who also had this whole othering question that was happening to them. And so if you go to Venice this year, I think in the Scandinavian pavilion, that group have been able to have, a greater access to telling their story in contemporary art, which I think is really important.
Right. The Sami, is that?
The Sami, precisely, yeah. And so, there are these Sami representations in the work, which is in the kind of dream sequence when you see sort of the footage, which is the infrared sort of footage within the work. And so there are these different representations of otherness, so to speak, to the Scandinavian Arctic space, which I was also trying to work in this piece.
Right. I know that we are getting close to the hour, but having said that, there is one one aspect that I'm wondering about that we could talk about a little bit, which is that, this is part of a trilogy that you put together, the Expeditions trilogy, and this is the first in that series. We recently screened, just before this, Western Union Small Boats, and the middle portion of that trilogy is Fantôme Afrique. And so Expeditions, when you've talked about it in the past, this is a still from Fantôme Afrique. It is, you're looking at this trilogy, using this trilogy to talk about the movement of individuals and kind of through in new and hostile terrains. And by hostile, I mean, sometimes that's physically hostile, but other times it's kind of politically hostile. And I'm wondering, you've described it as a way of talking about globalism and the movement of individuals into these new different places, and kind of looking at these issues through a human lens. So this is something like, how is this? Did you know when you started True North this was going to be a trilogy? Did you envision, the three? Maybe you didn't know all three that you were going to make, but you knew that True North was going to be the beginning of this trilogy, or did that come later?
No, I think sort of like in a way what happened in making True North, it began this sort of journey of going into the archive, and the works like Fantôme Afrique, which were the series of images that you saw before this work, which is sort of connected through Vanessa Mari character, who is, I'm trying to create a kind of transtextual character that gets quoted from one film into the other. And so she, in a way, has this sort of emblematic presence where she's occupying these different geographical regions. So, of course, there was a sort of, Arctic North and the sort of Sahara, Burkina Faso South in terms of Africa. The different hues of the different landscapes. Fantôme Afrique also was about another expedition, a sort of pun on sort of Afrique Fantôme, Michel Elyse, and the Surrealists in French culture, and their sort of expeditions into Africa, and bringing back these, if you like, expedition finds into French culture that would be, begin the conversation around surrealism and ethnography. And then in my modern day expedition, you could say, with my crew going to Burkina Faso and going there because its capital city, Ouagadougou, is the center for African cinema, and finding this other way of thinking about culture in this sort of expedition. Hence the sort of archival reference in this work, and the focus on Ouagadougou as a sort of culture for capital in Africa. And then in Western Union Small Boats, it's a kind of almost a reverse expedition, you could say. If you're able to go to the next slide, you get in Western Union Small Boats this return to the Mediterranean in Sicily, where the work was shot, and in a way looking at an island, Lampedusa, which is between Africa and Europe, where in 2007 it began to be the location of many people from the south, from Africa, trying to escape drought conditions, wars, poverty. If you go to the next slide, please, it begins to be this sort of expedition in reverse, where the traveling that took place in one particular moment in the 20th century, these journeys, after all resources have been extracted, those populations are then in a way deemed to want to go to the West. If you go to the next slide, please. And so one begins to see this whole sort of question of expedition and traveling in this reverse direction in a work like Western Union Small Boats. And literally just today, a friend told me who works now as a kind of guard in Kent, said that there's still literally hundreds and hundreds of people who are fleeing war-torn destinations, from the south, trying to enter to England. Of course, this is not reported actually in the news, but this is an ongoing scenario. So it doesn't really matter how many barriers or threats which are used, where people could be, deported to Rwanda, or whatever sort of nightmarish scenario that the current government invents and actually uses to deter people. This journey, this movement is a continuous one, as it is, of course, where the border between sort of Mexico and America, where this is an ongoing scenario, because of course bodies will flow to the logics of where capital is located. So this was, I guess you could say, my final work in this sort of expedition trilogy was Playtime, and I work on capital because it's, my work, we have these movements that were taking place. And of course, all my research leads took me to capital as being the kind of reason, apart from ecological devastation and wars, which are, of course, currently pending one for us.
Yes, sadly. And in many ways, I must thank you, Isaac, for giving that a lovely overview of the expedition series, because it is happy to say that after when True North comes down, we will have Fantôme Afrique on view. And so that is a great way for individuals who have seen the films, or even who haven't, to please to come back, to keep coming back to Ruby City to then see that final installment. And I should also say that, you know, again, to reiterate that True North is on view here at Ruby City through the end of the year. And I should say too, Isaac, I'd love to keep talking, but I don't want to be cruel, because it is midnight where Isaac is. He is very graciously agreed to appear with us at our 5 o'clock meeting here in San Antonio, but you know, midnight now for him in London. So thank you, Isaac, for being here. I just want to thank all of you for watching, and especially the Carver Community Cultural Center for being such great partners in this series. And of course, for the staff here at Ruby City for making this possible, and the team in Isaac's studio for helping out with all of the kind of tech aspects and the PowerPoint, the slides that you saw, the films, for making those available and being so gracious and helpful. So Randy and Barbara, thank you very much, who are here, the team at Ruby City, and Vlad, thank you over there in Isaac's studio. And I want to thank you, Isaac, for taking the time and sharing so much about this.
Thank you, Elyse.
Really appreciate it.
Really. And Ruby City, it's a pleasure, absolute pleasure.
Thank you. So I will say good night to you, and thank you again.
Thank you. Yes, I'm off to bed.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.